Welcome to Pop the Left. Today, Doug and I talk about the revolutions of 1848. This is part one of a two-part conversation.
This is pop, yeah, yeah. This is pop, yeah, yeah. This is pop, yeah, yeah.
Listen, why don't we get started? I'm just going to ask you my first question here, which is that would it be fair to put the Revolution of 1848 into the context of the end of the age of monarchies?
I would say it maybe even is the end of the age of imperialism and the old style.
That was my next question, is to what extent does this also have to do with the rising up of the nation state as a dominant political form?
It totally is, because that's the only thing that really succeeds in 1848. So, in 1848, what you have, the result is a conservative backlash, but a conservative backlash that more or less, with the exception of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, starts to respect the idea of national sovereignty, and nations also move from being conceptions of religio-linguistic groups to nation states. Now, what's fascinating about that is the idea of a nation state actually is far older than that. It goes back to the early modern period in the Treaty of Westphalia, and it's roughly contemporaneous to, say, the Reformation and that interregnum period between the end of the medieval state in England and the First Revolution / English Civil War.
Right. The nation state didn't just emerge out of whole cloth in 1848 by any means. I mean, at first I thought it wasn't even obvious to make an association between the rising up of the bourgeoisie and capitalist order and the creation of the nation state, given that history that you just pointed to. But it does seem to me that nonetheless that you can sort of see it taking its final shape in 1848 and after. That right. The 19th century is as much about the dividing up of the world into nation states as it is about the creation of capitalist economies and industrialization.
And there does seem to be a reason why, like, capitalist globalism actually does seem to be dependent on nation state actors as its like intermedium governing form. And I couldn't exactly tell you why, but it does seem completely related, because even in the cases of, like, the few absolute monarchies that exist in capitalism, and you got a couple, Saudi Arabia, most of them are in areas where there are, like, high export levels of raw commodities, and the economies work a little differently than developed capitalism, but they're still fairly, like, rich per capita. You're still dealing with national state forms, even if you're dealing with, like, non-republican forms, which means that, it does seem like capitalism likes late republicanism as its dominant. I mean, in so much that capitalism likes anything, right? We don't want to be too reificating there, but as its dominant form, it also definitely likes the nation state, because, like, even things that have regressive world orders still exist in nation states, and that's consistency of language within the political polis, the insistence on the standardization of language, the insistence on a lot of things. I mean, one of the biggest things is maybe urbanization requires massive literacy, and having 85,000 micro languages, which was actually common in the imperial period, is not super efficient for that. I mean, so there's all kinds of stuff that seems to come out of this. I mean, there's reasons why that agrarian order just totally falls apart. And that falling apart happened completely differently in England, which is why I don't totally discount, like, the Robert Brenner thesis of capitalism, that England's sort of unique, because England had a transition both out of its absolutist monarchy into some kind of hybrid form, and its economy also transitioned from agrarian to actually agrarian capital. And the only other places where you see that are the quote unquote settler colonial nations, which are places that, are settled after capitalism starts to develop. So that's a pretty big difference. And you don't see that in Europe. Europe, that doesn't happen that way. Europe, you have a collapse. Like the agrarian system fucking collapses between 1785 and 18.
Yeah, and the Holy Roman Empire collapses right after. I mean, the French Revolution. It's already collapsing.
Yeah, it's already fracturing to shit and back, and the kind of people beginning to coalesce around national identities was already beginning to be a problem for it. What's interesting about that, in some ways, in the say late medieval, early modern period,
what we're talking about there is like the
1300s, 1700s.
Okay,
so
yeah.
You're still talking about a big swath of time, but you're talking about like the period where you see the various religious reformations, the end of the medieval absolute state, the beginning of things like parliaments and representative bodies and representative states. The beginnings of what could be called like pre-bourgeoisization, the rising of like a merchant class and mercantilism, which lays the groundwork for capitalism. It's like also transitional forms. Like all these things kind of happen over a 400-year period. In England, they seem to happen the fastest because of a weird mixture of like very specific economic conditions and also religious reform. So those two things seem to happen together. But it's also interesting what England never had because it didn't have in 1848. So, for example, England's never had national land reform. Like most farming well into today is technically tenant farming in England. So there weren't really peasants. You actually did have tenant, like the agricultural sector was wage labor and rents. And that happened in England from the enclosure movement forward. But it also meant there was never like a removal of aristocratic privilege there. There still isn't. And in the United States, you didn't have the aristocratic privilege in the first place. But we did kind of move from yeoman farming, which is like slightly more advanced than peasant farming because you kind of own the land, and you own your own means of production, but you do have additional wage labor, and your taxes aren't to a specific lord or whatever. To what we have now, which is actual agrarian capital, and that's not even a large sector of our economy. As I think Bordiga used to say, that a modern capitalist economy cannot stand having more than like 15% of its economy, or maybe even 5%, but I think 15% of its economy in the agricultural sector. The capitalism doesn't function that well under that, and he seems to have been right.
So let's try to zoom in a little bit because we've been taking a very big picture approach, but just around the turn of the century to the 19th century, after the fall of the Holy Roman Empire, after Napoleon was vanquished. And in a way the French Revolution was undone.
You first have a period of like colonial national liberations, even though they kind of technically speaking aren't nations. And then you have a period of basically slave liberation. Like that happens between, after the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. Then you have a wave of revolutions in Latin America that kind of rocked the world from, say, 1795 to, say, actually as late as 1850. And some of them even later. But you have those waves of revolutions. They're much more protracted than the American Revolution. They're much more understudied. They lead to, concurrent series of civil wars, which we underplay as part of this too. The Civil War is tied into this, though we're still very broad. But that seems to have some kind of feedback loop into Europe, partly because the French, because the French keep on going all over the place on this, because you have the kind of compromised Napoleonic regime, then you have the restoration of the Bourbons. Well, that doesn't last very long. Then you have the establishment of the imperial constitutional monarchy under Louis Philippe, and then you have the next Napoleonic period, and then you have another, the kind of the Second Republic. So that playing huge because that doesn't just affect France. Like you have the fact that Napoleon had tried to spread his Enlightenment values and the kind of enlightened absolutism throughout Europe and really busted up the Holy Roman Empire bad. I mean, because that's really what fractured everything.
Let's take a moment to. I thought it was after the revolution that Napoleon took power. That was Napoleon the Third.
Yeah. I'm talking about Napoleon the First. So it doesn't help that France's governments are changing so fast and they keep flipping back and forth. So like the way I try to explain this is to people who just know bad teenage pop culture is why the hell is Les Mis? Like, why is it so hard to figure out which revolution we're in and who we're fighting for or against?
Right.
But there's a theory that Robert Brenner has behind that too that influenced me a lot is the French model like was several different kinds of absolutism to try to like broker in modernity with a kind of like you can even see like the Jacobins as sort of like revolutionary bourgeois absolutism, which doesn't quite work because it's both a free and a command economy, and that the contradiction there is too great to be sustainable for very long. I mean, because one of the things that ends the first republic is not just a terror. I mean, that does it too, but it's also the fact that like the civil wars and shit have bankrupted the French government,
right?
And they can't feed everybody. And so this really codifies some things that in 1848 you see the codification of some things that are kind of perpetually with us. And that Marxism sort of half deals with. Not gonna lie, like you see the first real urban-rural divide about the government really start to take shape, particularly in the 1840s. Like where does the Bourbons get their police force from? Where they get it from the countryside, because no one in the city will join the cops, basically.
I think one thing I was confused about was King Louis Philippe became king in 1830.
Right.
So it was in between the Bourbon reign and the new constitutional monarchy. That
Bourbon reign, yeah, the things really get amped up. The reason why it's a little bit confusing in France is there's really a series of mini revolutions that happened between like 1810 and 1848. Like 1848 is just the biggest one after the first. But you have all these you keep on having these punches and coups and reversals and new constitutions, and like those are really kind of like low key revolutions,
right?
Different sectors of the ancien regime or the like very elite of the bourgeois class keep on reasserting themselves, and that's kind of where things get muddy in France, and why when you talk about 1848 in France, you're not talking about 1848, you're talking about like 1830 to 1849.
Right.
Whereas everywhere else, it's actually pretty clearly 1848 is when it happens.
Right. But it starts in France in a way. That's where people point to when they say it's where it started.
It starts in France. And what's interesting is the Americas are not really, particularly the United States, aren't really in it. England's not really in it. And you kind of have to explain that. And then Russia doesn't have it. Another thing to remember is the places where there were successful communist revolutions were all in the periphery of 1848. Like 1848 doesn't really happen in those areas. And one of the biggest reasons is Russia's just not developed enough. The Russian countryside economy is like at 13th century standards.
In a way, we could almost say 1848 reaches Russia in 1917.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. Or 1914 at
1914, yeah, okay.
Maybe the earliest, but yes. I mean, there are some stuff that there are reforms in Russia that tie into this, like, the Tsar Liberator and stuff really comes on after 1848 in Russia going, oh, we don't want to go there.
But there's still this long, the thing I was saying at the start was that there's sort of a long process of overturning and of absolutism or the age of monarchies throughout the 19th century. and that, it's unclear as to when, I mean, by your own account, by pointing to Saudi Arabia, we may not be fully out of it yet.
Well, I mean, you can really the fact that this was called the springtime of the nations and the Arab Spring was called the Arab Spring is not accidental, even though no one remembers that. Like, there's a reason why we always call those revolutions springs. I mean, the springtime of the nations also is because 1848 is successful for the progressive coalitions in the spring, and they're crushed in most of Europe by the fall. But then most of those regimes, most of the revolutionary regimes are completely gone and wiped out by 1851, but only to be reestablished by reform shortly later. So it's,
Right. So the other thing that I noticed was that there's a big emphasis on the different famines that are going on.
Yeah. And the famines are actually kind of artificially produced. They're not deliberately produced.
No.
But they're artificially produced because people start fucking around with industrial agriculture and monocropping.
Right.
But they're idiots and they don't understand we don't understand genetics yet. So we keep on monocropping our way into disease blights.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that was one of the reasons why. I mean, there was also just the way it was irrationally exported. There were all these exports of crops like potatoes out of areas that were racked with famine.
Right. And then you start having the empires that don't have extra European colonies are much more subject to the famine. So one of the reasons why there's a couple of reasons why it probably doesn't happen in Britain, but one of the biggest ones is the British Empire is just spread out in so many different ways that its famine problems are localized. And they exacerbate them for localities like Ireland or India.
Right.
But they do not actually exacerbate them for the whole empire.
So, so my question here is that before this period in history, there had been famines.
Tons, but not to the scale.
Not to the scale, and it was also probably not perceived to be a political issue the same way.
No, I mean, because the famines were, you had a bad rain crop. They weren't because the other thing about these imperial policies is because of the way they were enforced, and also because of the demands for market crops being standardized, led to kind of enforced standardization on former peasants. And prior to that, if you had a bad crop, you just grew a different fucking crop. Right. You probably had trouble paying your taxes that year, and your child got conscripted or something. But you didn't have a mass scale everybody dies famine. I mean, a city might die, but not the entire country.
But is there a connection between the development of the idea of political freedom and the socialization of production?
I think 100% true.
Yeah, and I was directly thinking about the famines. I was thinking about how when you start to see your lot as being held in common, then you also start to see your need for political freedom and power in order to protect your own interests.
Right. And interesting as class divided as bourgeois society is, and particularly this early form of it where it wasn't really even truly. I mean, one of the things about early liberal bourgeois society is it's not entirely clear yet that it's going to be capitalism as we understand it. That really is not 100% set in stone yet.
And by that you mean the domination of the industrial capitalists hadn't been firmly established.
The domination of the industrial establishment, the establishment of free and wage labor, there are these other ideas. I mean, Prohune, for example, was kind of based off this. And the United States was based off this too, separately. That we would be petty proprietor states. There would not be massive wage labor. The United States did not it's political. It's if you go back and read the Federalist Papers, it's clear they don't think massive wage labor is ever going to be a thing. There's rich and there's poor, but that has to do with land holdings. And so even the U.S. had a different view, in general, of what this society was going to be yet, but we didn't have capitalism as an established system. And so it's easy to go back, most of our modern historiography goes back and reads capitalism into that, even though no one's talking that way in that period.
Right. And that means that the development of an industrialized working class, an industrial working class hadn't really emerged fully in that time.
Right. It really only emerges in the United States during and after the Civil War.
Right.
Like it's a little bit later development here, and in England had ways to offset it through the empire.
Hadn't its development been one of the things that set off the Civil War?
Yes, totally. I mean that's why the slaver states felt like they had to spread slavery, because without spreading it, they didn't feel like they could maintain against the industrial output. And even though, you know, there's a lot of good arguments to be made that like American settler colonialism is dependent on capitalism, the slave economies themselves saw themselves competing with capitalists. I actually recently did an appearance on a podcast talking about this Southern sociologist named Fitzhugh,
Mm-hmm.
who saw slavery as a form of socialism, for real.
Wow.
And he's the first person to use the word sociology in English. And he thinks that he's writing contemporaneously to Marx in the 1840s and 50s, and he's published in the 1860s, and he's mentioning like Fourier and Saint-Simon and stuff like that and he just says like capitalism, blah, look at all this freedom and look at all this instability,
Right?
Like we need socialized production, and we need stability, and screw this freedom cross stuff. So like even if, you know, slavery is a form of primitive accumulation that like the settler colonial states needed for their form of capital, the slaver states saw themselves in direct competition with industrial capitalism.
Yeah, and there was I've been looking into this today as well about I'm trying to track down to what degree the plantations in the South were in debt to either to Southern banks or to Northern banks around the time of the Civil War. You know, there was an economic crisis right around that time, at least a recession. And I'm just wondering how much debt was part of the story.
I know there's a ton of debt. If you go back and like even see like post-Reconstructionist narratives about the debt, but you hear about people losing their plantations and having to break it up into to sell parts of it to tenant farmers and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What I don't know is who they owed the money to.
Right.
Like, I don't know if they owed it to Southern or Northern banks. And also banking during that time period was not centralized because there was no, I mean, like we barely had a common currency in the United States.
Right.
Until the Civil War.
Right.
So
it was only after the Civil War that there really was this feeling that the agricultural South was being screwed over by the industrialized, financialized North.
Right. But the reason why there was competition about spreading slavery, because remember the issue that starts the Civil War is not the maintaining of slavery in the South, it is spreading it to new territories.
And they wanted to hold on to that mode of production because they saw it as being under threat.
Yeah, and they saw it as more genteel and less base than the industrial capital.
Really?
Yeah, they did, and that's actually like a large part of the argumentation. You see that even in the parts of the South that reject slavery as an institution, they still maintain the nobility of the Southern agrarian economy versus the industrial North that goes well into the 1930s.
Yeah.
And now, what does that have to do with
1848? Yeah,
1848. I mean, that's happening concurrent to it. Also, what's happening is America's great land grabs. You know, you have one of the reasons why we can't have an 1848 is, well, we kind of stalled the Civil War by having another war. Like we have the Mexican-American War,
right,
during this time period, and the beginnings of the Indian Wars, which really start before the Civil War, but really kick up steam afterwards. So we're just kind of out of the game. What's also happening, though, is these liberation of the slaves happens in these other European colonial economies, particularly in Spain and England and France. Mm-hmm. Everybody starts liberating their slaves in the 1830s. That probably does accelerate some of the industrialization pressures. It's hard to know which one comes first there. Probably industrialization, but they're both even from a Marxist perspective, they're both material concerns. So it's hard to figure out which one to prioritize. But it exacerbates the recession cycle in the industrial economies. Like that becomes clear pretty quickly. And that also is why it wasn't hard to like get these, anti-slavery bourgeois factions to start like arguing for the reinstatement of slavery and particularly in French colonies. And that going back and forth in the early 19th century. Like that like flips twice. So these are all tied together. And so we're just in the context. We haven't even gotten to like the specific revolutions yet outside of France. Because the other thing that really happens is Italy.
Right.
Italy is divided up into three states, one of which is a literal papal theocracy after the fall of the Holy Roman Empire. And Italy has Italy has a republican tradition that goes back to the late Middle Ages, early modern period. Arguably, they had city-states that were so mercantile they were venturing towards capitalism. Some would even say were capitalistic. I don't take that stance, but some Marxists do.
Yeah.
But they're not unified, like at all.
Right.
There's no common language. People forget how fractious the Italian language was. And in Italy in particular is where you start to see this weird coalition of liberals, Republican nationalists, constitutional nationalists, national monarchists, and anarchists all on the same side. That starts in the Italian city-states, so much so that like Polish and Russian, progressives and anarchists start flocking to Italy to like help them. So you have weird stuff like Bakunin and the early Italian nationalists, particularly the Republican ones, I believe like Garibaldi, are like allies.
Right.
So, and that eventually spreads into the German states as well. But that starts in Italy.
So the Holy Roman Empire, where did that, what territories did that spread across?
The original one?
Yeah, well, the one that collapsed in 18.
The German states, the Austro-Hungarian states, the Italian states, a lot of the Scandinavian states, and in fact, the first real nationalist revolutions are the Scandinavian states, and Spain was part of it, but breaks off and becomes an independent, like subsidiary, like an independent kingdom, but related to it, almost immediately. But they're also tied into it.
So when their struggle for for like a republic, and maybe it would just be a struggle for nation statehood, for their own nation. Maybe it was expressed only as nationalism. Maybe it was expressed as republicanism. But it was at that time in the early 19th century, that was a struggle against French occupation.
It was a struggle against French and Austrian occupation. But the struggle against French occupation really starts coalescing it. That's also true in Spain. So it really it starts a kind of national identity. Ironically, but then it turns against the divisions between the papal states, the parts of Italy that are held by the heir of the Holy Roman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the parts of it that are kind of quasi-independent or still aligned to France or whatever. There's a bunch of different factions in Italy.
Yeah, but the struggle for a German identity was also a struggle around Austria.
Yeah, it was a struggle around Austria. It was a struggle around the fact that German peoples have never had a unified state. You start seeing that with you had the emergence of the German princely states, but we got to remember that those were not like Prussia and Bavaria and the Tyrolia and the Eastern German bloc, Saxony. These were quasi-independent nations,
right? Within the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah, within the Holy Roman Empire, and then after the Holy Roman Empire falls, within the coalition of princes.
Okay, tell me about the coalition of princes a little bit.
So the weird thing about the way the German states work is after the Holy Roman Empire, because the Holy Roman Empire is always the German sections of it are always kind of ruled by princelings, and the princelings often became the heirs of other states. I mean, the Hanoverian line, for example, are now the English monarchy. So that was an interesting development because there being so many princes in Germany also meant that these minor royal houses produced a shit ton of the heirs for the other established houses in Europe. So everybody had a stake in Germany. And Germany had a relatively consistent language, partly because like the Reformation and the Gutenberg printing press have meant that German like English had been standardized much earlier than, say, Italian or Spanish. And so there was a consistent linguistic identity, but there was no singular political power outside of this coalition of princes. Now, why were there a coalition of princes? Part of that was a concession to the Reformation to end the religious wars that wrecked the Holy Roman Empire. And actually that's where like the idea of nation states began. It's the Treaty of Westphalia. But the Treaty of Westphalia lets Protestant princes have ruled Protestant areas of the German lands, and Catholic princes rule Catholic areas of the German lands. And that leads to these sort of like culturally somewhat homogenous areas having princes in themselves. But it's a really fractious system, as you can see, because particularly after the Holy Roman Empire falls, there's not really a singular political entity controlling the whole thing.
Right.
Which leads to a bunch of wars, which, gives us like 1848 kind of starts it, but it's really the Prussian conquest that finishes the establishment of the German nation.
And so one thing that just to note is that all of this political intrigue and dissolution and reformation is going on kind of parallel to changes in the economic realm and the development of a working class. And
basically you have capitalism leaving England and France, and the Enlightenment going all the way out to Russia.
Right. And so, but it's in the context of that these old forms are sort of breaking apart and trying to reform.
Right. And these old forms are also based off of peasant economies, which don't really exist anymore. That's the other thing. Like their tax base is based on peasant economies. You don't really have a consistent establishment of payment in kind. So you don't have consistent currencies except for metal bullion. And even that's not completely standardized. It's kind of loosely market standardized, but it's not, so these ideas are not consistent. There's not consistent ways to trade. But you now have urbanization and factories that need trade to happen. You have a massive shift in classes. You also have a whole lot of people who had one skill set, which is mostly agricultural, who now have to pick up another skill set, which is early industrial labor. And it's one of the first times where, bourgeois production doesn't require like a lot of passed down skills.
Right. So at that time there was a call, or there was the development for these newly developing workers who were sort of have lost their land and were being urbanized. There were national workshops.
Yeah, there was in France. There was a call for national workshops.
Okay,
so the national workshops, in France alone, and it was led by the first people who called themselves socialists as a political movement, led by Louis Blanc.
When was this? Well, this was before 1848.
It's before 1848. It's like in the 1830s, early 1840s. It's also undone pretty quickly. But Louis Blanc calls for the government to become the employer of last resort. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
And to establish national workhouses for men. There's then a independent women's movement that emerges.
And they demand work as well?
They demand work as well. So the national workshops are expanded to women. Then they are immediately completely shut down.
Right.
But it is interesting, like, if you want to see, like, the beginnings of a whole lot of modern politics, even, like, feminism as we know it. The first wave of feminism, even in America, sweeps to America in 1848. Like, it almost is a weirdly, like stuff is bubbling up everywhere.
Right. And that was because, for women particularly, it was because their role in the household was far more constricted than it had been in a more agrarian setting.
In the more agrarian setting, as long as your family held the land, it didn't really matter if you owned anything.
Right.
Like you had access to your family parcels and whatnot. Now you don't. And in fact, like, women had right of ownership, but that wasn't true in a lot of Europe. And you have this massive. You also have like women wage laborers for the first time. France is a big area where this happens because a lot of men die in the various revolutions and wars.
Right.
You have the two Napoleonic expansions and all that. Like a lot of men were dead, so they had filled the shops with women.
Right.
So that's all playing a pretty big role in what's going on beforehand. But the bourgeois leadership kind of, during this time period, with the help of Louis Philippe, cracked down on this.
Who had been in power when the national workshops were taken up?
The national workshops came out in the end of 1847 and really get established in 1848 with Louis Le Blanc. Right after the abdication of Louis Philippe causes an industrial crisis, but they only last for like 3 months.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they work. They're only really they last from February to June. And then, and honestly, when they close them down in June, it leads to another series of uprisings in June and July against the Second Republic,
right?
Which leads to the coup that puts Louis Napoleon in the start of the second or third the Second Napoleonic Empire. Anyway, I get my numbering of French empires off, but
And what year was that?
By the end of 1848.
Okay.
So it's a flash pan.
Right. So that would be Louis Napoleon III.
Yeah, that's Napoleon III, which I don't know where the second Napoleon goes to, but
he probably just had a nice life somewhere. We'll have to look him up.
Right. But this is really when you start like the fall of Le Blanc leads to the various French socialist movements like Le Bouffism, Saint-Simonism, a lot of these groups, which eventually coalesce into the Communards, start to form at this time. Because, stuff is still messed up in France for another 30 years. France is constantly providing Marx with a model of what not to do.
Right.
So, there you go.
So I guess we're about 48 minutes in here, and I feel like we should maybe try to kind of give a little timeline of what happened in 1848 briefly. So, where it started in France, it moved to Italy and Germany.
It moves quite fast. So in spring of 1848, it really kicks off in the Italian states and concurrently in France. The reason why we say it starts in France is there's really events in France that happened that lead up to it before 1848. But the first kind of struggles actually happen in Italy.
Okay.
Then the tension in Italy and France spread immediately over into the German states and into the Habsburg Empire, leading to the calls for various Slavic, Hungarian, Galatian rebellions. Then it spreads from there into Sweden, Switzerland, Poland. And Poland's is the most interesting because Poland's really, Great Poland's really the beginning of their first republic. It's it and Sicily are the last truly feudal monarchies left.
Mm-hmm.
And so they really fall. And then it spreads into the Romanian principalities. It spreads into Belgium. It spreads into Ireland. Ireland gets put down so fast they just most of Ireland then runs to the Americas. And then at last it spreads to Spain. This all happens in the spring.
Right. And a republic is formed in France.
Right. A republic is formed in France. An attempt at a republic is formed in Italy, although it itself is weird because Sicily is ruled by the remaining Bourbons and stuff. It's a strange period. But there is a constitution for a confederation of German states put forth that just doesn't last very long.
The story I remember from France is that King Louis Philippe abdicates himself and tries to give the kingdom over to his grandson.
Right.
And so there will be a regent, the Duchess, the the grandson's Comte is the name, the would-be king, and then his mother will be the real ruler. But when he's being inaugurated or being accepted into the position of king in the parliament, the proles smash through the doors and stop the proceedings, and instead a provisional government is formed.
Yeah, provisional government is formed, and then there's elections for the Second Republic.
Right, and it becomes a republic pretty much against the will of the provisional government. Like they realize if they're going to hold on to power at all, they have to go with the will of the public, who has gotten the misunderstanding that there was going to that anyone wanted a republic who had actually had any power. Is that close to
yeah,
right?
That's true. Yeah, and the March Revolution happens in Germany, which is huge, but in almost every case it fails. Mm-hmm. Because Metternich, even though Metternich, who's this princeling and kind of the architect of the Confederation of 39 independent German states, ends up being able to play on the tensions between the bourgeois and the working class components of the revolution, because there's also, Germany has some of the most radical working class factions, even more than France. But what happens is the bourgeois and working class components actually start fighting each other, and the conservative aristocracy is able to crush it before it ever really gets to establish itself. Very similar to, say, the Spanish Civil War in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. In Denmark, you have the establishment of a new king, but with liberals in the cabinet and in like a liberal
a constitutional monarchy
situation. A constitutional monarchy. You have the attempt of that in the Habsburg Empire with, Czechs, Croats, Slovaks, Ukrainians, and Hungarians kind of temporarily having quasi-republics, the most successful of which are in Hungary and Galicia, but they don't last very long. So I think that most of them are put down by 1851. Sweden, it only pretty much lasts during March. Mm-hmm. But it's actually one of the areas where there are the fewest casualties. I think only 18 people died. In Switzerland, you have the Sorbonne War, which leads to various Swiss republics and cantons fighting each other, but they can't unify because of religious tensions. And then, but it's actually it's one of the ones that's kind of successful in that there's a compromise state established at the end of 1848, and a confederated Switzerland emerges. You have a military insurrection against the Prussians and the removal of the traditional feudal powers in Greater Poland, but it is eventually, like, Poland never gets a break. It leads to tensions between the Germans in Poland and Poles, and then the beginnings of the anti-Semitic waves that kind of wrecked that place. Yeah. Up into the 20th century start then. That does basically just ends in a stalemate, being divided up. Romania, ends up with a lot of stuff ends up passing hands, and Romania still doesn't totally break free the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then Belgium has Belgian things, and then you have the Young Islander.
What does Belgium have? They have Belgian things.
It has Belgian things. The Belgian one I always forget happened.
I think you could say that about any moment in Belgian history, but anyway, yeah.
I know that Belgium expels Karl Marx in March.
Okay.
Because he tries to help organize the Belgian revolutionaries.
Right.
And the Belgian legions attempt to cross the frontier and lose. And then in Ireland, due to the potato blight, you have the Young Islander rebellion against Britain. But it's also kind of hard to, because there's egalitarian and radical republicanism,
right?
But there's also a lot of reactionary Catholic nationalism in it, and greater Catholic against Protestant issues. It really gets put down by a counterinsurgency by the British, and that leads to mass immigration into the United States, which actually even affects the Civil War. It's where a lot of the Union's troops come from. Just straight off the boat, straight into the field. And then in Spain, you have an attempt to form a parliamentary monarchy, modeled on the very brief July monarchy in France, and it leads to a kind of second republic. There's an attempt at a revolution, and there's another revolution in 1854. There's another counter-revolution. Spain just ends up a mess until like the 20th century.
So one of the things that I think is clear from this.
Thank you for listening to Pop the Left. We'd like to thank our producer, Toby Keemer, and everyone at Zero Books for supporting the podcast. Please contribute to the Zero Books Patreon to keep us going and to hear additional episodes.